must obtain permission from the copyright owner. That said, our broadcasters want their material spread like a fucking virus. So click share, download, copy, embed, upload, do whatever it takes. Start now. Do it every day. You're listening to Truth Broadcast Network, where the truth will set you free.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, you're listening to the voice of the American dissident, and I'm your host, Jeffrey Whittla. Today I joined a rather interesting website. It's called www.theteapartycommunity.com. I talked to a few people there and kind of got their feel of things, and basically, I believe that most of the people there think that by electing more politicians that claim to be for freedom, that we can somehow solve all our problems. Well, tonight, I'm going to give them and the world some proof of how they've been deceived and suckered and lied to over the years. And it's going to be eye-opening, I hope, for some people on this site that I just joined, and it's going to be a revelation for the rest of everybody else. Most people are in the conservative movement today. They like to point to former President Ronald Reagan as one of their political icons and heroes. Well, tonight we're going to get the other side of the story, the well-documented side of the story of who Ronald Reagan really was and what he really did to the American people. During his political career, when he started out, Ronald Reagan was actually called Red Ronnie in Hollywood circles because of his intense leftist leanings. He was also cited as being a member of the Communist Party. It wasn't until the 1950s when he realized that after losing election after election, he had to switch to the Republican Party in order for people to see him as politically palatable. One of his nicknames was he was called the Great Actor. And the great actor he was. He was a great actor for the American people. Remember when he claimed and proclaimed that the Soviet Union was the evil empire and that they were an enemy of the United States. And then on another hand, he turns around and he signs disarmament agreements with them. One of his friends, Armand Hammer, whom you can find pictures of with him, was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He was a frequent visitor to the White House. He was a good friend of Ronald Reagan's. And it was all a lie and all a deception perpetrated on the American people. And what I'm going to cite tonight is from a well-documented book called The Shadows of Power, The Council on Foreign Relations in the American Decline, and it was written by James Perloff. This is a copyrighted work, and all credit and all documentation is due to the author. And I'm going to bring up the PDF, and I'm going to get it prepared here, and we're going to start. It's from chapter 11 of his book, A Second Look at Ronald Reagan. We're going to zoom in as much as we can here and get it formatted so we can begin. Reagan and the establishment. After Mao Zedong took power in 1949 with help from the State Department, the cry in America was, "Who lost China?" In the autumn 1979 Foreign Affairs, editor William P. Bundy wrote a piece called "Who Lost Patagonia? Foreign Policy in the 1980 Campaign." Bundy patently feared that Jimmy Carter's foreign intrigues would revive deep scrutiny of the U.S. government and its establishment connection. His article contended that our allies were falling apart on their own, that it was happenstance that this occurred on Jimmy Carter's watch, and that there should be no reckless charges like those raised about post-war China. Many Americans, however, and I went way up where I didn't want to go, and now I'm way behind where I need to be. So bear with me here, and I'm terribly sorry, and I don't know how this happened, but we will get back to where we need to get. Forgive me. And I'm getting down where I need to get. I'm terribly, terribly sorry, ladies and gentlemen. And we're wasting time here. Whoop, we gotta go back up. Where are we at here? I'm sorry, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. Where we went here, I gotta try to find where we were at. Hold on, I'll get there. Let me go back to the camera here a second, ladies and gentlemen, while I try to get back to where I was. As I said, Ronald Reagan was not a conservative. He was called Red Ronnie in his intimate circles when he was in Hollywood. And I'm going to get back to where I need to get here as soon as I can. And I don't know what happened. And I'm going through a PDF that I have uploaded to Scribd. And it should be right here. And I don't know what happened here. And why this is doing what it's doing. But I'm going to see what I can do here. Why everything is going crazy on me. If I go back up, I will see what I can do here. And I don't understand why I can't find what I need to find. But I was just there. And we're getting, there we go. I found it again, and I'm very sorry, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll get back to what we're doing. His article contended that our allies were falling apart I'm having trouble with this. So why don't we start all over? After Mao Zedong took power in 1949 with help from the State Department, the cry in America was "Who lost China?" In the autumn 1979 Foreign Affairs, editor William Bundy wrote a piece called "Who Lost Patagonia? Foreign Policy in the 1980 Campaign." Bundy patently feared that Jimmy Carter's foreign intrigues would revive deep scrutiny of the U.S. government and its establishment connection. His article contended that our allies were falling apart on their own, that it was happenstance that this occurred on Jimmy Carter's watch, and that there should be no reckless charges like those raised about post-war China. Many Americans, however, had different ideas, even those unfamiliar with the establishment and its modus operandi, since something very wrong with Jimmy Carter's foreign policy. Though the major media kept mum, smaller publications joined with conservatives in stripping the trilateralist of his farm boy mask. Even campaigner Ronald Reagan hopped on the bandwagon, addressing trilateral monopolization of the Carter regime. This helped Reagan win the backing of Main Street conservatives and primary victories over George Bush, who was known as the establishment Republican in 1980. David Rockefeller, Edwin Rockefeller, Helen Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, Mary Rockefeller, and Godfrey Rockefeller all gave the maximum contribution allowable under law to Bush, a true establishment scion. His father, along with Robert Lovett, had been a partner in Brown Brothers Harriman, Averell Harriman's international banking firm. George Bush was skull and bonesman, a director of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the Trilateral Commission. He shrewdly resigned from the latter two as he initiated his campaign. Ronald Reagan thus began by playing the Goldwater of 1980. But soon he proved that his Hollywood training was not for naught. Kerry Williams noted in the Los Angeles Times in July of that year, "It is my belief that the establishment, that elusive but very real force in American life, has of recent weeks opted decisively for Ronald Reagan." In the August 1980 Playboy, Robert Scheer reported, prior to the New Hampshire primary, David Rockefeller convened a secret meeting of like-minded Republicans aimed at developing a strategy for stopping Reagan by supporting Bush, and failing that, getting Ford into the race. Reagan heard about the meeting and was, according to one aide, quote, "really hurt," unquote. This aide reports that Reagan turned to him and demanded, quote, "What have they got against me? I support big oil, I support big business, why don't they trust me?" unquote. In any event, when Reagan scored his resounding triumph in New Hampshire in February, the overtures to the East began to work. New York establishment lawyer Bill Casey, CFR, who became campaign manager the day of the New Hampshire victory, began building bridges and promising that a more moderate Reagan would emerge after the Republican convention. Indeed, one did. Reagan picked Bush for his running mate, and after the election put together a transition team that included 28 CFR men. Among them, Eternal John J. McCloy. As president, he appointed more than 80 individuals to administration who were members of the Council, the Trilateral Commission, or both. For his chief of staff, later Treasury Secretary, Reagan designated James Baker, who had been Bush's campaign manager. For those of you, ladies and gentlemen, who have never heard of the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission, I strongly suggest that you start researching who they are. Presidents come and presidents go, but the members of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission always pop up in administration after administration. You take a look at former President George W. Bush and look at who he staffed with his administration. Donald Rumsfeld, CFR, Richard Cheney, his Vice President, Council on Foreign Relations, and many other members that also served in his father's administration. Look at the administration of Barack Obama. You have many members in his administration that were members of the Clinton administration. So this hope and change mantra that you're promised every 4 years is nothing but smoke and mirrors and consumption for the masses. For Treasury Secretary, later Chief of Staff, he chose Ronald Reagan, a Harvard Wall Street CFR man. His original Secretary of State was Alexander Haig, a former assistant to Cyrus Vance and Henry Kissinger. When Haig joined Kissinger's staff in 1969, he was a colonel. By 1972, he had become a 4-star general, an leapfrogging career reminiscent of Marshall and Eisenhower. Later, he became Supreme Commander of NATO and was, of course, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Succeeding at State in 1982 was George Pratt Schultz. A director of the CFR and member of the Pratt family of the Standard Oil fortune. It was Mrs. Harold Pratt who donated Pratt House to the Council. His appointment seemed pleasing to back-to-back authors in Foreign Affairs, to which the Secretary contributed the lead article for the spring 1985 issue. Known as an advocate of accommodation with the USSR, it was he who years later had signed the accords resulting in the Kama River truck factory being built for the Soviets by the West. When Schultz picked retired banker John C. Whitehead for Deputy Secretary of State, the New York Times commented, quote, "Mr. Whitehead brings to the job no apparent expertise in international diplomacy." In describing his attributes for the job, Mr. Schultz said that Mr. Whitehead was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was regularly invited to dinners given by Henry A. Kissinger, the former Secretary of State. As Secretary of Defense, the President named Caspar Weinberger, who had been a Nixon administrator and belonged to the Trilateral Commission. He was replaced in 1987 by Frank Carlucci of the CFR. In 1985, Winston Lord, President of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former Kissinger aide, became Reagan's ambassador to the People's Republic of China. When Lord left Pratt House to assume his new responsibilities, the Council needed a new president. One of the 3 final candidates under consideration was Robert McFarlane, who had been Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisor. Reagan chose Malcolm Baldrige, CFR, as Commerce Secretary, William Brock, CFR, as Labor Secretary, Alan Greenspan, CFR, Trilateral Commission, as Federal Reserve Board Chairman, and the list goes. Ronald Reagan has been billed as a thoroughgoing conservative, but history bears witness that, like Eisenhower's and Nixon, his conservatism rarely goes beyond his speeches. Campaigning in 1980, Reagan said he intended to balance the budget by 1983. Jimmy Carter's annual federal deficits ranged from $40.2 billion to $78.9 billion. Under Ronald Reagan, Mr. Reagan, the red ink came to a record $127.9 billion in fiscal 1982, then skyrocketed to $208.9 billion in 1983. The subsequent deficits in billions of dollars were as follows: 1984, $185.3 billion; 1985, $212.3 billion; 1986, $220.7 billion; 1987, $173.2 billion estimated. Reagan's annual deficits have actually exceeded the annual budgets of Lyndon B. Johnson, who had a Vietnam War to pay for as well as a Great Society. He has chalked up more government debt than all the presidents before him combined. It is true that Congress shares in the responsibility for this, but the blame cannot simply be offloaded on them. The president's own budget proposals have contained estimated deficits in the $100 to $200 billion range since fiscal 1983. And why, ladies and gentlemen, would you think that I would want to rehash old history? I go back through history to give you facts. Facts that either you have ignored or facts that you have never been privy to. Mr. Reagan, like every other president that we have had, continues to spend, at that time, spent money that we didn't have. And our president today, Mr. Obama, spends money that we don't have. So what is the difference between a conservative and a liberal? There is no difference, ladies and gentlemen, because the goal will remain the same, that eventually our government is going to go bankrupt and the American people are going to be the ones that suffer. It is true that Congress shares in the responsibility for this, but the blame cannot simply be offloaded on them. The President's own budget proposals have contained estimated deficits in the $100 to $200 billion range since fiscal 1983. Reagan is touted as an enemy of taxation and big government. Yet during his first term, although he did cut taxes, he also pushed through the largest single tax increase in our nation's history, as well as boosts in the gasoline and Social Security taxes, and big government got bigger. The civilian workforce in the executive branch grew by nearly 100,000 between 1981 and 1986. In 1983, Walter Heller, former economic advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, was prompted to write a column in the Wall Street Journal entitled, quote, "Mr. Reagan is a Keynesian now," unquote. In 1984, economist Richard Parker echoed this conclusion in the Los Angeles Times, noting while he proclaims Reaganomics success, Reagan also owes Americans a shocking confession. He's become a born-again Keynesian. That same year, economist Lester Thurbo, this thing is going nuts on me. I wish it would work better. Observed in Newsweek that Reagan has become the ultimate Keynesian. He continued, "Not only is the Reagan administration rehabilitating exactly the economic policies it pledged to bury when entering office, it is applying them more vigorously than any Keynesian would have dared. Imagine what conservatives would be saying if a liberal Keynesian Democratic president had dared to run a $200 billion deficit." Supposedly a proponent of military strength, candidate Reagan criticized Jimmy Carter for abiding by the SALT II Treaty, which the Senate had refused to ratify. He called it fatally flawed and said he would spurn it. Yet as president, he complied with SALT II until late 1986, even after the treaty would have expired had it ever been ratified, and despite numerous Soviet violations. In 1986, he ordered 2 Poseidon ballistic missile submarines dismantled to ensure we would stay within SALT II limits. The president agreed to no increase in defense spending for 1986, whereas White House hopeful Walter Mondale had advocated increases of at least 3% annually. Thus, Reagan's defense budget that year was actually smaller than the one opposed by his Democratic rival. In the New American in 1986, William F. Jasper summed other holes in the president's warrior reputation. The Reagan administration has also cut back construction of new Trident submarines, refused deployment of Minuteman III missiles despite its authorization by Congress, reduced MX missile plan deployment, continued deactivation of B-52 strategic bombers, canceled production of air-launched cruise missile B and Trident I submarine-launched ballistic missiles, cut back production of the B-1 bomber, and failed to reconstruct our dismantled anti-ballistic missile ABM system. In short, Mr. Reagan's policies have been disastrous for America's defense capabilities. Today, while the prospect of SDI is becoming increasingly remote, few Americans seem to realize that the nuclear deterrent of the United States still consists principally of antiquated B-52 bombers. And ladies and gentlemen, under William Jefferson Clinton, he continued this policy of the dismantlement of our military capabilities. Most of our B-52 bombers are gone, and we're down to stealth bombers, which we have very few of, and they continue to dismantle our ballistic missiles and remove them from their silos. And if you don't believe it, if you have enough money, you can go buy an abandoned missile silo anywhere out in the western United States, and if you have millions of dollars, you can convert it into a nice fancy condominium. We got to get back under here where we were supposed to go, and I don't know why it's not working, but I hate doing this. Designed under Truman and constructed under Eisenhower and Kennedy, ICBMs from the Kennedy-Johnson-Nixon years after sitting in their silos for 2 decades, no one really knows how well they would work. And Poseidon submarines built before 1967. Ronald Reagan has reinforced those with some new B-1 bombers, MX missiles, and Trident submarines, but in very limited quantities, considerably less than the rates of attrition would call for. In contrast, the Soviets have never stopped expanding and modernizing all segments of their nuclear forces. Reagan's most significant strategic advance was probably the placement of medium-range missiles in Europe, and these he agreed to withdraw completely when he signed the INF Treaty in late 1987. Contrary to the popular impression, the Reagan administration has left America on the brink of decisive nuclear inferiority. Most people consider the president a determined anti-communist. This was an image he established early on with his well-publicized description of the Soviet Union as an evil empire, but here again his actions have fallen short of his words. When communist Poland defaulted on its interest payments to American banks in 1982, Ronald Reagan didn't pressure Warsaw. Instead, he bailed out the banks by having the U.S. taxpayers pick up the tab. Where have we heard that from before, ladies and gentlemen? The taxpayers picking up the tab. The Reagan administration channeled money into El Salvador to help Jose Napoleon Duarte win his 1984 election over the anti-communist Roberto de Abusian. Duarte is a socialist. He has seized the nation's banks and large farms. In fact, when he previously ran for president in 1972, his running mate was Guillermo Ungo, current leader of El Salvador's Marxist guerrillas. When Jimmy Carter broke relations with Taiwan, Ronald Reagan called it an outright betrayal of a close friend and ally. As president, however, he did not attempt to restore relations with Free China. Furthermore, in August 1982, he issued a joint communique with Peking stating that the U.S. does not seek to carry out a long-term policy of arms sales to Taiwan. Under Reagan, trade with Red China has greatly multiplied. In 1986, the administration pressed through Congress the sale of $550 million in advanced avionics excuse me again, ladies and gentlemen. And I lost it again. I'm sorry. Here we go. Equipment, giving some of the mainland's fighters an all-weather capacity Taiwan's Air Force lacks. In Angola, Jonas Savimbi's unit of freedom fighters are trying to unseat the pro-Soviet ruling regime, which is kept in power by nearly 40,000 Cuban troops. Much publicity has been accorded the $15 million in military assistance given Savimbi by Reagan, but overlooked is the more than $200 million in credits granted Angola's Marxist government by the Export-Import Bank. Tens of millions in aid have also been sent to communist Mozambique, even though excuse me again, ladies and gentlemen, even though it is using Soviet weapons to suppress a liberation movement by the pro-Western Renamo, Mozambique National Resistance. When the Philippine crisis reached its climax in 1986, Ronald Reagan joined hands with the international left, withdrawing support for President Marcos. Foreign Affairs, which had previously served as a forum for Benito Aquino, anticipated the situation in its winter 1984-1985 issue. If Marcos cannot or will not accept the reforms necessary to ensure stability, then we must be willing to call his bluff and look even further down the line, toward the inevitable emergence of a new Philippine leadership. The article stated that the fate of the Philippines must remain an internal affair, but added U.S. leverage should not be underestimated. U.S. efforts to shape the setting for the inevitable Philippine transition can almost certainly have some benefit. Ferdinand Marcos was no saint, but he may look like one compared to the communists, if and when they wrest the islands from Corazon Aquino. In response to the Afghanistan invasion, Jimmy Carter embargoed grain to the Soviet Union, but Mr. Reagan approves the sale of our wheat to Moscow again at heavily subsidized rates. On December 27, 1986, the President warned the Soviet leaders, quote, must be made to understand that they will continue to pay a higher and higher price until they accept the necessity for a political solution involving the prompt withdrawal of their forces from Afghanistan and self-determination for the Afghan people. The very next day, however, administration officials said they were ending most controls on the export of oil and gas equipment and technology to the USSR. Reagan did allow Afghanistan's brave freedom fighters, the Mujahideen, some weapons, but he pledged to cut these off during his negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev in December 1987. This curtailment, in fact, had been brewing as much as 2 years earlier, at the time according to William Safire in the New York Times. 3 State Department functionaries cooked up a plan to accommodate Soviet demands about withdrawal from Afghanistan. The key concession: permit the Russians to continue arms shipments to its puppet government while the U.S. cut off aid to the Mujahideen. The secret letter assured Moscow that upon the day its troop withdrawal began, quote, foreign interference, quote, would stop, meaning that the CIA channeled aid to the Afghan rebels would be terminated. It is known to insiders as, quote, the Day One deal, unquote. American aid to the Afghan resistance, but not Soviet aid to the puppet Kabul regime, would stop on day one of the year-long Soviet troop pullout. After exposure led to public protests, the president began to disavow the policy, but a UPI story dated March 21, 1988 carried this incredible report. The United States and Soviet Union, seeking to ensure an orderly Soviet troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, are sharing data on radical Islamic guerrilla factions viewed as a threat to settlement, according to administration officials. Oh, I hate this. And we're going to get this back here. And we're going down, and I'll get it. Just bear with me. Such maneuvering may mean curbing U.S. support for the Islamic rebel factions the administration has so relied on during the 8.5-year-old guerrilla war against Soviet occupation forces, they said. A CIA source said, speaking of the rebels, confirmed a shift in the U.S. position and said, we want to see some groups fed to other groups. Intelligence terminology for neutralizing undesirable elements. Ask about U.S.-Soviet discussions about the Mujahideen. A State Department spokesman declined comment on grounds it is an intelligence matter. Conservatives have been pleased with some facets of Ronald Reagan's performance, such as his judicial appointments and the Grenada rescue mission. There is, of course, the controversial Contra aid he has sought, but this, despite energetic congressional opposition, is far less than the Nicaraguan freedom fighters would need to defeat the Sandinistas, whose army takes to the field with heavy tanks and helicopter gunships from the Soviet Union. At best, they are being allowed to fight a no-win war of containment. Furthermore, the administration has backed ex-Sandinistas and other former opponents of Somoza, such as Eden Pastora and Adolfo Calero, as heads of the Contras, giving the whole operation the smell of a sellout. Even Pastora, known as Commander Zero, has been a guest at Pratt House. As this book went to press, the Contras had been forced into a ceasefire on Sandinista terms, with a de facto surrender in the works. The Reagan record shows that, all things considered, his policies are the same ones that have steered our nation for over 50 years. That the establishment has tolerated him for 2 terms tend to suggest that it may be more comfortable with a conservative image Republican as president. This allows its program to advance relatively unhindered and puts Washington watchdogs to sleep. In 1971, Lyndon Baines Johnson said of President Nixon, "Can't you see the uproar if I had been responsible for Taiwan getting kicked out of the United Nations, or if I had imposed sweeping national controls on prices and wages? Nixon has gotten by with it. If I had tried to do it, or Truman or Humphrey or any Democrat, we would have been clobbered." Walter Mondale must have similar thoughts about Ronald Reagan. In an article in Foreign Affairs in 1981, former Kissinger aide William G. Hyland wrote foreseeingly, "Just as Nixon had the anti-communist credentials to develop an opening to Peking, so Reagan has the credentials to initiate a new relationship with the USSR." That presumably applied to the rest of the establishment agenda as well. We presume Mr. Hyland is familiar with the establishment agenda. In 1984, he replaced William Bundy as editor of Foreign Affairs. And here you will see some pictures. George Bush and George Shultz, heading a long list of personnel President Reagan drew from the Eastern establishment. You have Donald Reagan, and Alexander Haig. And if I can get this here to come up right. Why would a man who supposedly called the Soviet Union an evil empire and a threat to the American people allow a communist to sit in his Oval Office, the People's Oval Office, and smile with him? If I was President of the United States and had any morals and any values, any principles, and any convictions, no Russian would ever set foot in the United States, especially a communist like Mikhail Gorbachev. And incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, Mikhail Gorbachev, after he left the Soviet Union, opened up an office in the Presidio. The Presidio was a very prestigious military installation in San Francisco. And what he was doing there was he was helping to oversee the dismantlement of our armed forces. And here we have President Ronald Reagan with Red China's Zhao Ziyang. Again, ladies and gentlemen, why would a man who claims to be for the freedom of the American people even contemplate having relations with a regime that murders, butchers, kills and maims, and sacrifices its own people, all in the name of the communist ideology? And here we have our quote-unquote American president having relations with him. And I'm not just saying that this is something that Ronald Reagan has done. I'm saying that all of our presidents, no matter if they have a D behind them or they have an R behind them, are all working to aid the communist advance in the world. China, that I just read today on the internet, has the second biggest economy now in the world. I think that a thinking American should find that very frightening. A communist nation has the second largest economy in the world, and many Asian nations today announced that they will no longer use dollars tied to their currencies. They are going to use the Chinese yuan as their medium and measure of their currencies. And who aided, who made it possible, America, for this to happen? It was your leaders that were quote-unquote conservative, quote-unquote liberal, that are making this all happen. Our economy is weak. Our economy is weak. A poor economy, a weak economy is a national security issue no matter how you cut it, no matter how you slice it. 24 million Americans searching for work, millions more unemployed, is a security issue for the United States. So a $16 trillion debt is a security issue for the United States of America. It's physically impossible to pay off this debt, ladies and gentlemen. And people like the conservative Ronald Reagan and the liberal Barack Obama are cut from the same block of political timber. whether it's a Republican in office or a Democrat in office. It puts us on the brink of economic disaster, and it puts us on the brink of a military disaster. For if the United States goes broke and cannot pay its bills, how are we going to fund our military? And I submit to you that it's exactly what they want, ladies and gentlemen. It's exactly what they want. They want the economy of the United States to fail. And whether you believe this or not, there are Russian soldiers in the United States at this time on military bases. They have trained with American forces. And once the American economy collapses, these Russian forces, who all over the years have been aided and abetted by our politicians here, are going to begin to police the United States of America when there's a national emergency and martial law is declared. And what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to try to go, since we got some more time here, is I'm going to try to go down into another chapter and see if we can cover a little bit more. All of the American history we have just finished reviewing is factual, yet it is far from the traditional version. So the question naturally arises, why do the media avoid the various circumstances shown in this account, or at least downplay them? Why don't investigative news shows like 60 Minutes, perceived as gutsy and no holds barred, tackle the Pearl Harbor cover-up, American financing of questionable projects behind the Iron Curtain, or the trilateral CFR hold on our government? Surely such material would have sufficient audience appeal. The answer is almost self-evident. The mass media are subject to the same power behind the throne as Washington. For the establishment to induce public cooperation with its program, it has always been expedient to manipulate the information industry that is so responsible for what people think about current events. A prime mover in this process was J.P. Morgan. The original force excuse me. We'll get back to what I was talking about. And I hate doing this, but we're going to go back here. I'll click it a little bit and we will still go back here. And I'm sorry that this does not work, but I'm going to get back up here. The original force behind the CFR. In 1917, Congressman Oscar Callaway inserted the following statement in the Congressional Record. In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. These 12 men worked the problem out by selecting 179 newspapers and then began by elimination process to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. They found that it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest newspapers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers. An agreement was reached, the policy of the papers was bought, to be paid for by the month. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interest of the purchasers. This policy also included the suppression of everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served. The press, thus controlled, was very successful in persuading Americans to support our entry into World War I. However, in subsequent years, a number of books appeared that challenged the justification of our involvement, the merits of the Allied cause, and the wisdom of Colonel Hollis and his colleagues in devising the Versailles Treaty. These books included Henry Elmer Barnes' Genesis of the World War, Sidney Fay's Origins of World War 1928, and many others. After World War II, however, the establishment moved to preclude such investigation. The eminent historian Charles Beard, former president of the American Historical Association, stated in a Saturday Evening Post editorial in 1947, "The Rockefeller Foundation and Council on Foreign Relations intend to prevent, if they can, a repetition of what they call, in the vernacular, the debunking journalistic campaign following World War I. Translated into precise English, this means that the Foundation and the Council do not want journalists or any other persons to examine too closely and criticize too freely the official propaganda and official statements relative to our basic aims and activities during World War II. In short, they hope that, among other things, the policies and measures of Franklin Delano Roosevelt will escape in coming years the critical analysis, evaluation, and exposition that befell the policies and measures of President Woodrow Wilson and the Entente Allies after World War I." Dr. Beard noted that the Rockefeller Foundation had granted $139,000 to the CFR, which in turn hired Harvard professor William Langer to author a 3-volume chronicle of the war. Historians whose writings concurred with the authorized versions of events, such as Langer, Samuel Morrison, Herbert Fees, Henry Steele Commager, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr., were generally guaranteed exclusive interviews, access to government documents and statesmen's diaries, sure publication, and glowing appraisals in the front of the New York Times Book Review. Most of these men had served in the administrations they wrote about. On the other hand, historians who dared question foreign policy under Roosevelt and Truman, such as Beard, Henry Elmer Barnes, Charles Tansel, John T. Flint, and William Henry Chamberlain, suddenly found themselves blacklisted by the publishing world that had previously welcomed their works. Beard succeeded in issuing 2 volumes critical of the Roosevelt administration only because he had a devoted friend at Yale University Press. Before his death in 1948, he was smeared in the media as senile. In 1953, Barnes described how the censorship process worked. "The methods followed by the various groups interested in blacking out the truth about world affairs since 1932 are numerous and ingenious, but, aside from subterranean persecution of individuals, they fall mainly into the following patterns or categories. 1. Excluding scholars suspected of revisionist reviews from access to public documents, which are freely open to, quote, court historians, unquote, and other apologists for the foreign policy of President Roosevelt. 2. Intimidating publishers of books and periodicals so that even those who might wish to publish books and articles setting forth the revisionist point of view do not dare to do so. 3. Ignoring or obscuring published material which embodies revisionist facts and arguments, and 4. Smearing revisionist authors and their books." As a matter of fact, only 2 small publishing houses in the United States, the Henry Regency Company and the Devon Adair Company, have shown any consistent willingness to publish these books, which frankly aim to tell the truth with respect to the causes and issues of the Second World War. Leading members of 2 of the largest publishing houses in the country, ladies and gentlemen, have told me that whatever their personal wishes in the circumstances, they would not feel it ethical to endanger their business and the property rights of their stockholders by publishing critical books relative to foreign policy since 1933, and there is good reason for this hesitancy. The book clubs and the main sales outlets for these books are controlled by powerful pressure groups which are opposed to truth on such matters. These outlets not only refuse to market critical books in this field, but also threaten to boycott other books by these publishers who defy their blackout ultimatum. The historical suppression described by Dr. Barnes 35 years ago still operates today. It could be pointed out, quite rightly of course, that in more recent years American policy and policymakers have occasionally been savage, as with Vietnam, Watergate, and the Iran-Contra affair. However, such episodes did not bruise the Council on Foreign Relations or its allies. Instead, they stigmatized these people whom the establishment disliked and the very policy that has always opposed: nationalism and anti-communism. What we have operating in America is an establishment media. An erstwhile New York Times editor, John Swinton, once said, quote, "There is no such thing as an independent press in America. if we accept that of little country towns, unquote. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, do you think that by forming a group called the Tea Party of America, or this group or that group, that you're going to take on Washington, D.C., or you're going to take on the power structure, and you're going to beat them at the ballot box? I think that there are those people in the United States that are thinking way beyond comprehension. In order to change the United States of America, you need to ignore Washington, D.C. And what you need to do is you need to start, as I said in a different broadcast, with your city councils, with your mayors, with your sheriff, with your district attorney, with your state representatives and your governor. Elect them once, and only once, and you need to kick them out. And thankfully for the internet, there is a free press that's arising once again in the United States. It's broadcasts like these, my broadcast, and countless hundreds, and I hope thousands of broadcasts all over the internet that are working to bring the truth to the American people. And what I talk about here in my broadcast, ladies and gentlemen, is not conjecture. What I talk about are documented facts from the government, from books that are based upon government records, from policy statements, from publications, statements in their own words what they intend to do to this nation and this country and its people. I find it almost incomprehensible how the American people can call themselves informed and intelligent when nothing could be further from the truth. You can find the truth simply by going into government records. I had a conversation today with a lady, and I was talking to her about some documents that I obtained. And her question to me was, well, where did you get them? And I found that most astonishing. Where did I get them? I took the time and I took the energy to go to the library, and I requested them. And the documents that I talk about here are documents that I have in my possession, have had in my possession, that fortunately I was able to find on the internet, and that I'm able to share with you. I spend countless hours searching on the internet, trying to bring the American people the truth. This book that I'm quoting from, The Shadows of Power, written by James Perloff, was written 20 years ago. I wonder how many people in the United States even know the book exists. If you do a search on the internet, you can find it in PDF form, and as a matter of fact, according to what I read with the download, this book is in the public domain, and it's free to use, and I give all credit to the author, all credit to his documentation for its use. I have hundreds of books in my possession because I've taken the time over the years to read and to study. And watching the television set, ladies and gentlemen, isn't going to get you anywhere, because they are not going to tell you the truth. And I've just proven to you in a quote from a New York Times editor, which I will say again, quote, "There is no such thing as an independent press in America if we accept that of little country towns," unquote. Now, that was a New York Times editor, ladies and gentlemen, giving you a startling admission that there is no free press. There is none. There is no free press in the quote-unquote mainstream media. You are being fed lies. You're being fed half-truths and full falsehoods. What you need to do is you need to start to study. You need to start to learn to think outside the box. These are not conspiracy theories. There's no boogeymen hiding in the corner waiting to come and get you. This has all been out in the open. You can Google the Council on Foreign Relations, bring up their website, and you can subscribe if you want to pay the money to their Journal of Foreign Affairs. And I guarantee you, when you start reading the Journal of Foreign Affairs, you will know the foreign policy of the United States government, whether it's a Democrat sitting in the White House or it's a Republican sitting in the White House. Because the Council on Foreign Relations is an internationalist organization that owns the political process in this nation. And they control whoever sits in the world in the Oval Office. And that is a fact. The goal is to create a one world government, to destroy the United States of America, to destroy the world. And it's going on right in front of your face, ladies and gentlemen. It's going on right in front of your face. It always has been. It always will be. Until you throw off this term liberal and this term conservative, and you begin to understand exactly what's going on. And I will tell you right now that if we make it to the year 2016, that Jeb Bush will be the Republican nominee and he will be the next president of the United States of America, because he's a globalist. He's no different from anybody else. And if they try to rush their plans too fast, they will put the American people asleep by putting another Republican in the White House, and the goal will always remain the same. That they will still go ahead with their plans to create a new world order. The new world order that George Herbert Walker Bush spoke about September the 11th, 1991, in a speech before Congress. It's the same new world order that Barack Obama is working to bring about. It's the same new world order that Ronald Reagan worked to bring about. And I showed you that here tonight in a well-researched chapter in this book. It's the same new world order that Jimmy Carter worked to bring about, to aid and abet the advancement of communism and international socialism, while crushing the hopes and dreams of all freedom-loving peoples all over this earth. It was George Herbert Walker Bush, in a speech before the United Nations, that said, "It is in these principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter that we shall henceforth pledge our allegiance." And that was the social conservative that the American people got behind. It was the social conservative named George W. Bush that signed the Patriot Act into law, that allows the government to basically trample on all of your rights. And it's the liberal Barack Hussein Obama who's continuing the Patriot Act and who strengthened it by signing the NDAA Act. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be imprisoned without a chance to have a lawyer or a trial. I'm trying to help awaken the American people. And I will broadcast till there's every breath still in my body to bring truth to this nation. And that concludes our broadcast for tonight. God bless you all, and we'll see you next week.